The silence in the galaxy was suffocating. For millennia, humanity had spread across the stars, building a network of colonies that spanned light years. Communication between Earth and its distant settlements was a lifeline, but now that lifeline was being severed system by system. It began with a whisper, a strange signal emanating from the outer colonies, then a sudden blackout. Entire star systems went dark. The lights of distant suns blinked out without warning, leaving behind nothing but empty space. It was as though the stars themselves were being erased from the universe. The first disappearance was that of the Horizon, a deep space freighter returning from the outer rim. The crew had sent a final distress signal, a garbled transmission of panic and fear, before it was lost. No wreckage, no debris, not even a faint trace of its existence was found in its last known location. The black hole where it should have been was all that remained. Earth was on high alert, but it was just the beginning. The disappearances continued, slowly at first, then accelerating with terrifying speed. Planets that had once thrived with life were now silent tombs, their communication relays dead. The colonies, too, fell dark, one by one. No signs of battle, no signs of attack, just empty space. Nothing made sense, and in their place, an eerie calm settled over the galaxy, as though the darkness itself was waiting. The Titan, a military warship of the United Earth Fleet, was stationed near the outer edges of human space when the first wave hit. Commander Alex Kane stood on the bridge, staring out into the abyss of space, his brow furrowed with growing unease. His crew had reported strange readings, but Kane had hoped it was just the effects of the heavy gravitational pull near the outer rim. Now those hopes were fading. "Commander," said Lieutenant Marla Jensen, her voice tight, "we've lost contact with the Horizon. No signal, no response to hails. They've gone dark." Kane's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. The Horizon was on a routine cargo run. They shouldn't have been in danger, not in this sector. "Keep trying to reach them," he said, though his voice carried little hope. He turned to the tactical officer, who was watching his screens intently. "Sir," the officer spoke up, his voice laced with tension, "we've just lost the Aegis relay. It's gone, vanished." Kane's heart skipped a beat. Another one. "What the hell is happening?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His mind raced through every possible explanation, but none made sense. There was no indication of any known enemy in the sector. No alien civilizations had been detected. Before he could say more, the ship's comms officer, Ensign Zuraquin, looked up sharply. "Sir, we're receiving a distress signal. It's faint, but it's coming from the edge of the Veil Nebula." She paused. "It's human." Kane's instincts kicked in. Set course for the Veil, full speed ahead. As the Titan hurtled toward the coordinates, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy was slipping into something far darker than anyone could imagine. The Veil Nebula was a vast, uncharted expanse at the edge of human space, a place known for its dangerous anomalies and thick, shifting clouds of gas. But to hear a distress signal from that region was unheard of. It was beyond the outer rim. Nothing should have been there. A sinking feeling took root in his gut. Someone had been waiting in the shadows, and now humanity had drawn its attention. The war for survival had begun, and it was a fight against something unknown, something ancient. The lights of the stars may have vanished, but the darkness that followed them had only just begun to show its face. As the Titan sped toward the Veil Nebula, Kane stood at the bridge's viewport, his eyes locked on the inky void ahead. The distress signal had been weak, but it was undeniably human. Every moment that passed without an explanation felt like an eternity. The Veil was known for its interference with long-range communications, but this was something far worse than simple static. "Approaching the nebula, Commander," Lieutenant Jensen's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "We're picking up strange energy readings. It's like the signal is being scrambled. Our systems are having trouble processing the data." Kane nodded grimly. Increase sensor range. Keep searching for that signal. The veil was a dense, chaotic cloud of gas and dust, a place where light itself struggled to penetrate. Star systems on the outskirts of it were usually abandoned, left to the slow erosion of cosmic winds. But now, as they approached the nebula's edge, the atmosphere seemed almost alive. "Sir, there's something ahead," the tactical officer, Ensign Malik, interrupted. "Something large. It's not moving." Kane's pulse quickened. "Can we get a better visual?" The forward screens flickered and then cleared, revealing a ship. Or rather, what was left of a ship. It was drifting, half submerged in a thick cloud of swirling dark matter. The craft was a human vessel, a deep space explorer, marked with the insignia of the outer colonies. Its hull was twisted and torn, scorched black from what looked like extreme heat or perhaps intense pressure. What was most disturbing, however, was the complete lack of any power readings. There was no life sign, no engine glow, not even a faint signal. It was a ghost ship. Kane's stomach churned. "Bring us closer," he ordered. The crew moved quickly, the ship maneuvering through the edges of the nebula, avoiding debris that seemed to float in the air like forgotten relics. As they neared the ship, they opened a communication channel, hoping for a response. Static buzzed through the speakers. Then a voice broke through, faint but unmistakably human. "This, not safe, must leave." The message was cut off abruptly. There was no time to trace it, no way to know who had spoken it, or how long ago it had been recorded. The sense of dread in the air grew thicker. Kane felt a chill crawl down his spine. "We're boarding," Kane declared. "Prepare a search team. I want answers, and I want them now." Moments later, Kane, Lieutenant Jensen, and a team of elite soldiers were on their way to the wrecked ship. The Titan's airlock opened into the ghost ship, and the crew filed in. The corridors were eerily quiet, lit only by emergency lights that flickered on the walls, casting long shadows across the floor. The ship was in disarray, clearly damaged but surprisingly intact. What struck Kane immediately was the stillness, the unsettling absence of life. They moved cautiously through the ship, weapons raised. No one spoke, the silence deafening. As they reached the bridge, the source of the signal became clear. The captain's chair was empty, but the command console was still active, displaying odd readings, flashing sporadically with unreadable symbols. Kane approached the console, his breath shallow. "What the hell happened here?" Jensen whispered, her voice trembling. Kane didn't have an answer. Then, something caught his eye, a small black object on the floor. It looked like a piece of alien technology, pulsating faintly with an unnatural energy. Kane knelt to examine it, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as he touched it. The object hummed beneath his fingers, and a low growl seemed to reverberate through the ship. Suddenly the lights flickered, then died completely. Darkness enveloped them. Kane felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Before he could react, a chilling voice echoed through the ship's comm system, cold and rasping. "You have trespassed, and now you will join the void." Kane's heart raced. The shadows were not just in the stars, they had followed them. The oppressive darkness was thick enough to feel as though it had weight, pressing in on the crew from all sides. Kane's hand instinctively went to his weapon, his pulse racing. Silence settled like a shroud, broken only by the occasional hum of the damaged ship's failing systems. "What the hell was that?" Lieutenant Jensen's voice was barely more than a whisper, her flashlight casting a weak beam into the black void. Kane didn't have an answer. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to retreat back to the Titan, but something held him in place. The ship, though in ruins, seemed to be alive with an unsettling energy, as if it were waiting. He turned to his crew, trying to ignore the cold sweat creeping down his back. "Stay close. Let's move," he ordered, trying to mask the uncertainty in his voice. They moved down the corridor cautiously, each footstep echoing in the hollow silence. The ship was far too quiet, considering the damage. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle. The entire crew gone, as though they had simply evaporated. It was like the ship itself had become a tomb, one that was somehow still alive. Kane's mind raced. Whoa, what? Did this? They reached the central data core, where the last of the ship's records might still be stored. The doors to the chamber hissed open, and inside, the console glowed faintly, a soft red pulse. But the readings that flashed across the screen were impossible to interpret. Some of them were inhuman, symbols and data that didn't belong in any known language or code. Ensign Malik, who had been carefully studying the console from behind Kane, suddenly straightened. "Sir, there's something wrong. The data, it's being overwritten." Before Kane could respond, a sharp guttural noise reverberated through the ship, like something deep inside it had just awakened. The lights blinked back to life, briefly, and what Kane saw sent a shock through his body. The walls of the chamber were no longer solid. They were shifting, as though the very fabric of reality was warping, bending in unnatural ways. The floor beneath them groaned in protest, and the air became dense, thick with an unearthly presence. It was as if the ship was not just a vessel, it was a conduit, a doorway to something far darker, and it was opening. "Get to the airlock, now," Kane barked, his voice harsh. He could feel the weight of the unseen eyes on him, the oppressive force closing in. But it was already too late. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the crew back into darkness. The shifting walls collapsed in on themselves, distorting the very space around them. Something crawled in the dark, something monstrous, unfathomable. And then the whispers began, first faint, then growing louder, until they filled the air with a chorus of guttural voices. It was no longer just a sensation. It was as if something touched their minds, reaching out with a hunger that made Kane's blood run cold. "Stay together," he gritted out. "Don't let them get to you." The air grew colder, and suddenly, the shadows around them twisted into something more. Out of the corners of the room, dark shapes began to emerge, formless, shifting in ways that defied all logic. They were creatures made of pure darkness, their features only vaguely humanoid, stretching and flickering like shadows caught in a storm. They had no faces, no eyes, but Kane could feel them watching. One of the shapes lunged forward with an unnatural speed, tendrils of dark matter reaching for the crew. Jensen reacted instinctively, firing her weapon at the creature. The blast hit it, but instead of disintegrating, the shot seemed to pass through it like it was made of smoke. The creature only recoiled, letting out a low, unearthly growl. "Fall back," Kane shouted, pulling Jensen away as the thing slithered toward them. The corridor was changing, twisting in on itself, as if the ship was rejecting them, reshaping itself into a labyrinth. Panic set in as the air became thick with the alien presence. "Commander, we can't leave. The ship, it's not letting us." Jensen gasped, trying to steady herself as they stumbled through the shifting halls. Kane's eyes darted to the airlock ahead. It was still functional, but as they approached, the walls warped in their path, the shadows thickening into dense tendrils that lashed out at them. "We're not alone," Kane whispered to himself. The creature wasn't just in the ship, it was of the ship, part of its very being. This wasn't an attack, it was a warning. And it was clear now, whatever they were facing wasn't from this galaxy. The Drath were not just invaders, they were the manifestation of something far older, far more dangerous, and they had come for humanity. The airlock door slid open, but it wasn't the safety Kane had hoped for. As soon as the crew neared it, the walls around them seemed to vibrate, as though the ship itself was resisting their escape. Kane's heart raced as the door, which should have opened easily, refused to budge. Come on," he shouted, slamming his hand against the control panel. The system flickered, refusing to respond, as if taunting them with the knowledge that they were trapped. Behind them, the shadows shifted again. The dark shapes that had attacked them earlier were not just lurking, they were coming. Their unnatural movements seemed to defy any known laws of physics, gliding, stretching, bending around corners in ways that made Kane's stomach churn. "Commander," Jensen shouted, her voice filled with panic. "They're everywhere. We can't stay here." Kane gritted his teeth, but he didn't have a choice. They had to move, and fast. He turned back toward the corridor, his eyes scanning desperately for an escape route. The shifting walls seemed to twist at his every move, as though the ship itself was in on the attack. "We need to get to the Titan," Kane said through gritted teeth. "There's no time to waste. Let's go." With their weapons raised, they pushed through the hallway, each step heavier than the last, as though the very weight of the ship's dark presence was dragging them down. As they moved deeper into the bowels of the vessel, the lights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. Kane could hear the growls, the low, guttural sounds of the creatures, growing louder with every passing second. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on them from all sides. Suddenly, a sharp screech split the air, followed by the violent crash of metal as one of the shadow creatures launched itself from the ceiling, landing between them and the corridor ahead. Its form was nightmarish. Its body seemed to ripple and shimmer like liquid darkness, tendrils reaching out to ensnare anything in its path. Kane barely had time to react as the thing let out an ear-splitting screech, sending an icy wave of fear through the entire crew. "Open fire," Kane barked, his voice sharp with urgency. The crew responded immediately, their weapons unleashing a storm of laser fire. The energy blasts hit the creature, but as before, they passed through it, leaving no mark. It was like firing at smoke. The creature let out another terrifying screech, then began to retreat back into the walls, its form dissolving into the darkness once more. "They're evolving," Jensen said, her voice shaking. "They learn. We can't stop them." Kane's mind raced. This was no ordinary alien threat. The Droth, whatever they were, weren't just physical creatures. They were part of the very fabric of the ship. The energy they radiated seemed to manipulate reality itself, warping space and matter around them. "We need to move," Kane shouted again, his hand gripping his sidearm tighter. The group moved forward, pushing through the increasingly hostile hallways, but the ship felt less like a vessel and more like a living entity, one with a malevolent intelligence. The walls continued to shift, the floor buckled underfoot, and the very air seemed to warp around them. Ahead, they finally saw the faint light of the Titan's docking bay, but it felt as though the distance between them and safety was stretching endlessly. Kane glanced behind them, but the shadows were closing in again, far too fast. "Get to the airlock," Kane ordered again, his voice tight with panic. "Now." The crew sprinted toward the exit, but just as they reached the airlock, the walls around them closed off. Another shadow creature appeared, blocking their path. This one was larger, its form more solid and defined. It had eyes, if you could call them eyes. Dark, hollow pits that seemed to draw in all light. The moment it appeared, everything around it seemed to freeze. Kane raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the creature lunged. But then, in that moment, something unexpected happened. The air around them seemed to distort violently, as though time itself was bending. The creature hesitated, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Kane's heart skipped a beat as a bright light flared out of nowhere, illuminating the darkened hallway. A voice, familiar and reassuring, crackled through their comm systems. It was Commander Griffin, the captain of the Titan, his voice strong despite the interference. "We've got you, Commander. Hold tight." The ship's docking bay opened with a loud hiss, and the crew rushed through the airlock just as the creature made one final desperate lunge. But it was too late. The ship's weapon systems fired, and the creature disintegrated into a cloud of black ash, its form vanishing as if it had never existed. Kane stumbled into the Titan, his breath ragged, the door sealing behind him. He looked around at his team, shaken but alive. They had made it, but barely. The shadows were still out there, waiting. "Status report," Kane demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that surged through his veins. "We're under attack, Commander," Griffin replied, his voice grim. "The fleet's been hit. The Droth have already begun their assault on Earth." Kane's blood ran cold. This was just the beginning. They weren't fighting just for survival anymore. They were fighting for their very existence. The crew of the Titan was running out of time. The once familiar hum of the ship's engines now felt alien, warped by the cosmic forces that seemed to hold sway in the dark expanse of the nebula. Kane's mind raced as the claustrophobic corridors of the ghost ship shifted and closed in around them. His instincts screamed to get to the airlock, to escape the madness that was unfolding. But even as they sprinted, the darkness itself seemed to anticipate their movements, redirecting their paths. "Sir, the Titan, it's not responding to our comms." Lieutenant Jensen shouted over the din, her voice tinged with panic. "Something's blocking the signal. We're isolated." Kane swore under his breath, the weight of the situation settling heavy on his chest. "What about the distress signal? Any trace of it?" "It's gone. It's like it was erased," Ensign Malik reported, his eyes scanning his console with increasing desperation. "Whatever's behind this, it's not just taking ships, it's erasing them, making them forgettable, like they never existed." Kane's thoughts raced. The Droth, they were more than invaders. They weren't just after the human colonies, they were hunting history itself. They erased ships, erased records, and made sure that the universe would never remember the lives lost. "Hold it together," Kane snapped, trying to regain control of the spiraling fear that was beginning to infect his crew. "We need to find the bridge. We need to understand what happened here and how to stop it. There's a way out, I'm sure of it." They turned another corner, only to be greeted by a horrifying sight. The walls of the ship were alive, pulsing with dark energy. A grotesque shape writhed in the center of the corridor, a mass of shadowy tendrils and flickering lights, like a living being made of darkness. It stretched and contracted with each breath it took, its form constantly shifting and morphing, as though it were hungry for something more than just the ship. It was hungry for them. Kane's heart pounded as he raised his weapon, his crew taking defensive positions around him. But before they could fire, the shape split into a dozen smaller, writhing appendages that darted toward them with inhuman speed. Tendrils lashed out, grazing Malik's arm. He cried out, the flesh searing where the shadow touched him, leaving a dark, burnt mark on his skin. "We can't fight this," Jensen shouted, her weapon ineffective against the living shadow. "We need to get out of here." "Not yet," Kane growled. He had seen this before. He had read about the Droth, the ancient race that had disappeared long ago. Their technology wasn't just advanced, it was incomprehensible, built on principles of dark energy and mental manipulation. They weren't just using weapons, they were twisting the very fabric of reality. "We have to destroy the core," Kane said, his voice grim. "The ship is a conduit for them, feeding off its energy. If we can disrupt the core, it'll collapse." Malik stumbled back, eyes wide with shock. "The core's on the other side of the ship, by the reactor? You're insane." Kane turned to the others, his jaw set in determination. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop it now, the Titan will be next. We need to get to the reactor. Trust me, I'll keep the way clear." The crew hesitated for only a moment before nodding, each of them steeling themselves for the journey into the heart of the enemy's lair. They pushed forward, moving deeper into the dark belly of the ship. The twisting corridors seemed to resist their every step, and the shadows grew thicker the further they went. As they reached the threshold to the reactor chamber, Kane paused, sensing the change in the air. The pulse of dark energy from within was overwhelming, vibrating through his very bones. The door to the reactor chamber slammed shut with a metallic clang. A mechanical voice echoed from the walls, deep and echoing with an alien resonance. "You should not be here. You will never leave." Before they could react, the shadows exploded from the walls, forming into the monstrous figures of the Droth. These were not the formless shapes from before. These were solid, armored, and massive, each one taller than a man, and covered in shifting, dark armor that seemed to consume the very light around them. Their eyes glowed with an ominous red, their mouths contorted into grotesque snarls. Kane's heart raced, but he knew they were close, too close to give up now. With a roar, he charged forward, his weapon crackling with energy as he fired at the first Droth, the shot passing through its shadowy form without effect. "We fight," Kane shouted, "for Earth, for humanity." And with that, the battle for survival, for the very existence of humanity itself, began in the heart of the void. The crew fought with all they had, but deep down, Kane knew, even if they survived the Droth, the greater war had only just begun. The shadows were only a herald, and what was to come would test humanity's will to survive in ways they could never imagine. The reactor chamber was a nightmare, a war zone of shifting shadows and metallic screams. Kane's mind raced as he fired at the approaching Droth, his shots harmlessly passing through their shadowy forms. They were invincible in their current state. Each hit felt like he was throwing his energy into the abyss. The creatures advanced relentlessly, their forms morphing in and out of the darkness, faster than human reflexes could match. The crew fought back as best they could, firing and retreating, their weapons ineffective against the Droth's unnatural armor. Every time they tried to push forward, the shadows swarmed and closed in around them, forcing them back toward the chamber's edge. The ship itself seemed to groan in pain, as though it, too, were suffering from the dark energy coursing through its veins. "We need to destroy the core," Kane shouted over the chaos, trying to keep his crew focused. But even as he spoke, the ground beneath them shook, and the room pulsed with a low, menacing hum. "What are you waiting for?" Jensen cried out, firing her rifle into the mass of shadows. "We can't hold them off forever." Kane's eyes locked onto the reactor, its massive core glowing ominously at the far side of the chamber. It was pulsating with the same dark energy that fueled the Droth's presence. This was the heart of the ship, the heart of the invasion. He could feel it in his bones. If they didn't destroy it, the entire galaxy would be doomed. With a grim determination, Kane made his move, shoving his way through the chaos. The shadows lashed out, tendrils wrapping around his legs, trying to drag him into the abyss. But he fought through the pain, using all his strength to break free, knowing that the only way out was forward. Jensen and Malik followed closely behind, covering him as best as they could. Malik fired rapidly into the creatures, his shots causing them to flicker and twist, but never truly disappear. As they reached the reactor, the air grew heavier, and a surge of dark energy nearly knocked them off their feet. The Droth were closing in. This was the moment of truth. Kane didn't hesitate. He slapped a charge onto the reactor's exposed core. The device, designed to disrupt the flow of energy in the reactor, began to hum with power. "Get back," Kane shouted. He turned to his crew, pushing them toward the exit. They were too close. The ship was about to explode, and there was no time left. Jensen and Malik hesitated, their faces pale. "Commander, we can't." "We have no choice," Kane growled. "Move now." The reactor began to glow brighter, its hum escalating into a deafening roar. The shadows were upon them, but they could no longer stop Kane. The pulse of dark energy that had surrounded them for what felt like an eternity suddenly began to waver, flickering as the core reached critical mass. "Move, damn it," Kane shouted, pulling them toward the door. With a final, desperate push, the crew fled the reactor chamber, the pulse of dark energy roaring behind them. They barely made it to the exit before the entire ship began to shake, the walls screeching in protest. As they rounded a corner, the ship lurched, throwing them off their feet. Kane slammed into the floor, his head spinning, but he fought to stay conscious. The reactor had detonated. The core's destruction had sent shockwaves throughout the ship, and it was beginning to collapse in on itself. The Titan was their only hope now. They needed to reach the airlock and escape before the entire ship imploded. "Get to the airlock," Kane screamed, his voice hoarse. Now, they ran, stumbling over debris and rubble as the ship tore itself apart around them. The walls twisted and warped, as though reality itself was unraveling in the wake of the reactor's destruction. The Droth, though momentarily halted, were still in pursuit, their forms flickering and warping in the chaotic energy that engulfed the ship. Kane's heart raced as the airlock door loomed ahead, but as they approached, something even more terrifying happened. The shadows reformed before them, blocking their path. One of the Droth, its form massive and more solid than the others, stepped forward, towering over them. It spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers crawling inside their minds. "You cannot escape. This ship is but a glimpse of what is to come. You are the first. The galaxy is ours." The creature reached toward them, its tendrils growing, encircling their bodies in an iron grip. But before it could strike, the airlock door opened with a sudden blast of pressure. Kane didn't hesitate. He shoved the others through, diving in after them, the door slamming shut behind him. The Titan's engines roared to life as they sped away, the ship breaking free of the collapsing wreckage. Kane collapsed into his chair, breathless, covered in sweat. They had made it, for now. But the Droth were not gone. They had only just begun their war. "Commander," Malik said, his voice shaking, we destroyed the ship, but they're still out there. And whatever they did to that ship, it's not just about us anymore. It's about everything." Kane nodded grimly. "I know, but we're going to make sure humanity fights back." And with that, the true war began, one that would take humanity to the very edge of the galaxy and beyond, to confront an enemy older, darker, and more dangerous than anything they had ever known. The Droth had returned, and they would not stop until all of humanity had been swallowed by the shadows. The battle in the reactor chamber was chaos incarnate. Kane fired again, his shots ripping through the air, but the Droth were impossible to hit. Their forms shifted with every strike, bending and warping in ways that defied all logic. Every time a blast connected, it seemed to pass straight through them, the creatures undeterred as they advanced, their gnarled faces twisted in grim satisfaction. Jensen was the first to act. She sprinted to the control panel on the side of the chamber, her fingers flying over the buttons as she tried to access the reactor systems. "I'm going to overload the core," she shouted over the noise. "It'll buy us time, but we need to hold them off." Kane nodded sharply, his focus unwavering. He moved with deadly precision, taking cover behind a shattered console as a tendril of darkness shot past him. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, the very walls of the chamber groaning in protest as the Droth pressed their attack. "Malik, cover Jensen," Kane ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'll keep them off you." Ensign Malik nodded and sprinted toward the control panel, but the moment he moved, one of the Droth lunged at him. The shadowy figure extended its massive claws, slashing through the air with inhuman speed. Malik dodged, but not fast enough. The claws grazed his side, and he cried out in pain as the darkness seared into his flesh. Kane's blood boiled with rage. He fired his weapon again, this time aiming for the creature's center mass, hoping to disrupt its form. The blast seemed to make contact, but the Droth creature twisted away, unfazed. Kane knew then that conventional weapons were useless against them. They were far beyond human understanding. But there was something else. As Malik staggered back, the creature paused for a moment, and Kane saw a flicker of hesitation in its movements, an unnatural hesitation that seemed to echo throughout the chamber. It wasn't afraid, but it was sensing something new. "No," the words came from somewhere deep within Kane, as though his voice was not his own, but a command from something older, something buried within his DNA. The draft seemed to react to it, recoiling, their dark forms warping, as though the command was pulling them away. For a brief, fleeting moment, the creatures faltered. It was just enough time for Malik to reach the control panel and press the final sequence. The reactor hummed to life, energy coursing through the chamber in a brilliant pulse of light. Jensen looked up, her face a mixture of triumph and terror. "It's going critical. We've got 5 minutes before the core detonates." Kane's heart raced. He turned back to face the Droth, the shadows already regaining their form. The hesitation in their movements was gone. Their attacks became more violent, more desperate. They seemed to be fighting something, as though the signal they had just received was too much to ignore. The shadows in the room grew even darker, their forms coalescing into something more solid, something more alive. The Droth were adapting, responding to the reactor's instability as if it were a call to action. "Hold the line," Kane shouted, his voice carrying over the now deafening sound of the reactor's rising hum. The Droth were no longer a mystery. They were something ancient, something more insidious. But Kane had seen their weaknesses, their hesitation. It was the key to victory, the key to survival. "Let's show them what humanity is capable of," Kane muttered under his breath. He lunged forward, weapons raised, charging into the thick of the battle once more. The crew followed his lead, pushing back against the encroaching shadows with renewed determination. The Draft fought with unrelenting fury, but now they were no longer invincible. Their forms flickered and twisted, growing more unstable with every moment. The pressure from the reactor was taking its toll, making it harder for the invaders to maintain their shape. Every strike, every blow Kane landed, seemed to fracture their dark armor, making them weaker. The Droth shrieked, their howls of rage reverberating through the chamber as they fought to hold onto their form. Kane wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out, but he knew one thing: they had bought themselves time. Time enough to escape, time enough to turn the tide. Humanity was not ready to fall to the darkness. Not today. With each passing second, the room became more unstable. The air was thick with energy, the reactor's pulse rising to a deafening crescendo. Kane felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a deep sense of urgency filling him. The explosion was imminent. "We need to get out now," he shouted. "Malik, Jensen, move." The crew made a break for the airlock, the dark shapes of the Droth still snapping at their heels. But now they were no longer an overwhelming force. Their numbers were thinning, their power waning, and every second they gained brought them closer to escaping the hellish nightmare. The Titan waited just beyond the veil of darkness, its safety within reach. But the real battle was yet to come. The reactor was only the first step. They had won a battle, but the war, Kane realized, was far from over. The Droth were not done with humanity yet, and the darkness, once unleashed, would not be so easily contained. The Titan's airlock doors slammed shut behind them with a resounding clang, sealing off the horrors of the ship and the Droth for the moment. The crew stood panting in the cold, sterile silence of the Titan's entry bay, the glow of emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. But there was no time to rest. The reactor was about to go critical, and they were still in the grasp of the shadowy void that had swallowed their world whole. Kane pressed a hand to his aching chest, willing himself to stay focused. His heart still raced, his pulse erratic from the battle. His eyes flicked to Jensen, then to Malik, both of whom were equally shaken. They had survived, barely, but it was clear that their ordeal was far from over. "We've got 2 minutes before this ship blows, and we're still in the middle of nowhere," Kane said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to get to the escape pods, now." Jensen nodded, though she looked far more exhausted than Kane had ever seen her. "The reactor's already unstable. What about the rest of the fleet? Can we send a distress signal?" Kane's gaze darted toward the control room, the faint hum of the failing comm system still audible. "We'll try once we're clear of the blast radius, but I'm not counting on it. Whatever they did to the ship, it's like they erased everything. The Droth are way ahead of us. A pulse of violent energy rumbled through the ship. The lights flickered again, and the entire vessel groaned in protest. The countdown had begun. They had no more time to think. "Let's move," Kane barked, taking the lead as they rushed toward the escape pod bay. As they ran, Kane's thoughts churned. The Droth were not just invaders. They were destroyers, erasers of history, of memory. He had known the moment they'd engaged the creatures that their enemies weren't just fighting to conquer, they were fighting to rewrite everything. Humanity wasn't just a target to the Droth, it was a threat. The very act of their survival, of their resistance, was an anomaly in the Droth's calculations. And if the Droth had a hand in erasing humanity's past, how much of the future would they now seek to erase? The escape pod bay loomed ahead, a welcome sight, though it felt like a brief reprieve in an ever-widening storm. Kane pushed the door open and jogged inside, his boots clicking on the metallic floor as he moved to the nearest pod. "Get in, let's go," Kane gestured for Jensen and Malik to follow. Jensen entered one pod while Malik took the other. Kane stood at the control console, his fingers flying over the keypad. But just as he was about to initiate the pod's launch sequence, an alarm blared throughout the bay. The entire Titan shook violently, a sound like a dying beast echoing from deep within the reactor. Then a voice, a guttural, inhuman growl, sounded through the comm system. "You cannot escape. You are already ours." Kane froze, his blood turning cold. The Droth weren't done. They had infiltrated the very heart of the Titan, and now they were trying to follow them. Initiating emergency launch sequence, the computer intoned, but Kane knew it was already too late. The pod bay doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, and a shadow loomed across the room. The last remaining Droth, the creature they thought had been left behind, was closing in. There was no hesitation now. Kane shoved the console, forcing the pod bay doors to open with sheer will. The countdown on the escape pods began, and before the Droth could react, the pods were propelled into space, escaping the doomed Titan. The outside world was a vast, black void, filled with distant stars and cosmic uncertainty. Kane's pod shot into the nebula, the blinding energy from the reactor's impending collapse lighting up the surrounding darkness. He could feel the heat from the explosion even inside the pod. Behind him, the Titan buckled under the force of its own destruction, the ship erupting in a fiery burst of light that painted the cosmos with brilliant flames. For a moment, Kane was paralyzed by the sight. The Titan, their only hope, was gone. But something in him, something deeper, primal, stirred. This was not the end. This was not defeat. This was only the beginning. "We're not done," Kane muttered to himself, looking out into the infinite expanse. "They may have taken the Titan, but they've underestimated humanity, and that's a mistake they'll never make again." Jensen and Malik were both silent, the weight of what they had just survived settling heavily on them. They were still alive, but that didn't mean the war was over. The Droth weren't just a threat to Earth, they were a threat to everything, and as long as humanity stood, there would always be a fight. The stars beyond were silent, but in the distance, a new kind of energy was building, a power that only humanity could wield. The fight for survival had only just begun. Kane took a deep breath and stared into the darkened cosmos. The war of shadows is only the beginning.